Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of July. Now, today is technically the last day of July, so there is a chance that I would maybe finish another book today if I stay up late. If that happens, you'll get a clip of me in a different shirt with probably different lighting. But I'm thinking that's probably not going to happen. I considered doing like a whole just media wrap up for the second half of the month, but honestly, it would just be books. I've rewatched the first half of Feel Good again and watched random episodes of The Office. There's really nothing to report. And then music-wise, I'm just listening to a bunch of soft folk with gay yearning. Nothing is out of the ordinary. There's nothing big to report. So I'm just going to wrap up all of my books. I'm going to mention the books from the mid-month media wrap-up, but I'll put the link to the actual video if you want to hear more about them, and I'll go more into detail with the books that I read towards the end of the month, particularly the books that I read when I was vlogging and reading as many books as I can in a week because of a readathon that ended up having some problems. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the stuff I read. This month I participated in 2 different readathons, the Fuckathon and the Transathon. So I'll go ahead and put up both of those bingo boards so that you can kind of see what I did, but as I go along I'll also mention which prompt each book was for. So I started off the month with the Henna Wars, which was lovely. I would definitely recommend. I think I gave it 4 stars. Again, this was in the mid-month wrap-up, so you can check that out if you want to hear more about it. The Henna Wars fit the Fuckathon prompt of Fuck Theological Fundamentalism. Then I read Given Volume 1, which is a gay manga that focuses on musicians. It was super cute, and I'm stoked for the second volume. Next, I read Dear Evan Hansen, which I made a whole video of its own for because I talk about this as well as the musical. Then I read Being Hospitable by Mika Jones, which was one of my first experiences with adult romance, definitely my first with sapphic adult romance. This fit the Fuckathon prompt of fuck slut shaming. The next book that I finished reading was Our Dreams at Dusk, Volume 4. And I really loved this book. In general, I really enjoyed this whole series. I'm actually planning on reading it all together at some point. I really want to reread the whole thing. But it was really beautiful. I think I gave this 5 stars. There are 2 major plot lines that are going on at the same time that complement each other so well. One is so happy and positive, while the other is really sad, but it is a little bit bittersweet. I don't want to get into it too much. There's so much character growth with so many people. I love them so much. It definitely doesn't close up all of the loose ends, but it's closed off enough that I would accept this as an ending. But I would like there to be more to actually see the trajectory that some of the characters go in. Our Dreams at Dusk fit the Fuckathon prompts of a book written by a non-binary person and the prompt to read a graphic novel. I believe those are all the books that I finished reading before the readathon. The next 8 that I'm going to talk about, I read within a week, which I thought was pretty cool. They're all pretty short, but it was still neat. It was still a fun experience. Each of these I do talk about in a vlog, and I'll link each of those as I talk about it. The first one that I read was The Girl from the Other Side, Volume 1, and it was so good. I gave this 5 stars. I didn't really know 100% what to expect. I mostly bought it because the cover was interesting, and one of my coworkers said that it was good, so I was going to give it a shot, and I'm so glad that I did. It definitely has scary, almost like horror undertones to it, but the main 2 characters that you focus on are just pure sweet cinnamon rolls, all in their own way. Basically, for the majority of the thing, this black creature, I don't really know what it's supposed to be, but they are in charge of watching this little girl, and it's the only human that's basically around in this place. It's just really wholesome and sweet, even with the scary undertones. So I'm super excited to get a hold of the next volume. The next book that I finished during that week was Susan Sontag's Illness' Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors. I think that it's really good to have the context of Illness' Metaphor if you're going to read AIDS and Its Metaphors, which is what I wanted to read in order to go along with my HIV and AIDS history TBR. And I think that this is a really good backdrop and background. This is basically social analysis and critique of how people treat folks with certain illnesses, and how certain things are glorified or have been glorified throughout history, but also like the negatives with that, and then what other illnesses are just seen in a negative light. Throughout the book, they talk about tuberculosis and cancer, as well as syphilis. And then, of course, AIDS is the main focus of the last one. But it's really fascinating to see the different ways that these illnesses are treated, but also what is similar throughout them, and how even the ones that are glorified or romanticized in different ways, still, they still all contain the same base layer of victim blaming, which is just really huge. I think this is really good for anyone who's interested in disability studies in general. There are different things to critique, I think, especially with AIDS and its metaphors. I had a couple of qualms, a couple of questions, but overall it was really good. And I think that it's a good introduction and start to the TBR, like I mentioned. I think I ended up giving this maybe like 4.5 stars or something like that. These essays ended up fitting the Fuckathon prompt for fuck ableism. Next, I read the Hamlet graphic novel. This graphic novel is based off of the Shakespeare play, and of course I've read the Shakespeare play. I've read it multiple times. I'd be really surprised if you didn't know Hamlet at least a little bit. Basically, the whole premise is that Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. His dad ends up dying, so his uncle is marrying his mom. Hamlet's dad's ghost comes to him and tells him that his uncle killed him. So this is Hamlet's story dealing with that and going through the whole thing. I don't want to say too much. I don't think you can spoil a book that's been out for over 100 years, but it's good. I thought that the graphic novel was a neat adaptation. I think that if I were to have read the graphic novel by itself, I personally probably, I'm not really sure what I would have thought. I probably wouldn't have liked it as much. It was more like a novelty thing for me because I really enjoy the play. I think that this could be good and really accessible for people who super just don't do plays, don't understand Hamlet. I think that that would be a good gateway into understanding the play. However, if you're reading it for school, absolutely do not only read the graphic novel. If anything, pick up the No Fear Shakespeare of the play itself. I think there are multiple companies who do things like this. This is actually my copy from high school that's Shakespeare Made Easy, so I would assume it's, I don't know how different the translations are between No Fear and Shakespeare Made Easy, but my point is, if some random people watching this video happen to be reading Shakespeare in school, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this because I'm using a webcam, but on one side you have kind of the Shakespearean Middle English. This is not Old English. Old English would be like unreadable. This is actually really closer to New English because reading this is way easier than reading like Chaucer. But anyways, it's been a hot minute since I've looked at like the history of the English language. This side you have traditional original Shakespeare. This side you have a more modern version. I think that this would be a lot more helpful for students than this. This could get you into the story, and this could make maybe kids interested to read the play. But I think ultimately reading the play is just a totally different experience. But it was really neat, and I gave the graphic novel 3 stars. Next, I continued on with some plays, except this time I actually did read plays. And the collection that I read was Queering the Stage Through Plays and Monologues by Mia Shamblin. And this was a really neat reading experience. This doesn't only have the plays and monologues, but it has chapters that frame the whole thing that made it a really interesting reading experience because you have kind of the purpose behind why they wrote it. You had a chapter where they talked about their art in general and the style that they go with. And I think that understanding that is really important. The way that they use the erotic seems to be central to a lot of the ways that their plays function, whether they are queering the erotic and pointing out things that are maybe like negative or painful, or using sex like for sex's sake. There's a whole lot, and I would have to really dig into the plays and show you each one of them, but this isn't what you came to this video for. I actually do want to make a whole video looking at this and looking at other queer plays, just because there's so much that happens on an artistic level. I really enjoy poetry and queer poetry for the same reason. Where you get a whole other side of a person's experience, and especially the stuff that is very explicitly for activist purposes. It's just a really interesting experience. I will say that if you are interested in plays and stuff like that, this would be good. Just know that if you do go into this, that it does hit on some difficult topics. They talk about homophobia. They talk about suicide in the first chapter. They also discuss the AIDS epidemic. I think in one of these there is rape, or at least implied rape. So just be aware of that going in. But in general, this was a really neat read. I'm glad that I read it, and I'll definitely be rereading some of these. I go more in depth in my vlog about each one of them and kind of some of the ones that hit home certain places. So you can check that out and look forward to a more full video looking at some of this as well. Queering the Stage also ended up fitting one of the prompts for the Transathon because it is written by a gender fluid person. Next we had The Black Condition featuring Narcissus. This is a collection of poetry that outlines parts of Jayy Dodd's experience. She uses the myth of Narcissus throughout to really talk about the issue of self-confidence and the need to feel desired, I think, throughout a lot of it. They also talk about their experience of race as well as gender as a Black trans femme. So there are a lot of important themes going on, and artistically I thought that there was a lot of really great stuff going on. They have a number of different styles that they go to for their poetry. Some of these are songs, some are longer than others, and they use the page in different ways. Towards the end, they also used pictures within some of it. So overall, there's just a lot of really interesting stuff. I would definitely recommend this, and I definitely see myself rereading this, kind of along with a lot of the other queer poetry that I really enjoy. This book fit the Transathon prompt of a book written by someone who is trans feminine, and it also fit the Fuckathon prompt for fuck white supremacy. The next read of that week was probably the best book that I've read all year. Definitely the best fiction book that I've read all year, and that is The Seep. I was so stoked about this book. It blew my mind. Like, I knew that it was going to be good just because people had talked about it, but I did not know that it would, like, reach into my soul. And, like, this just hit on so many really cool themes. The whole bit of the story, so the plot, is that people gain alien technology, aliens come to Earth, and end up building this sort of utopia. But with this technology, you can do lots of new different things. The main character's wife decides to be reborn again, which is something that you can do. And the wife is really upset about it. So this is her journey through grieving. This talks about so many different things. Of course, it talks about the grief process, but it also just says so much about humanity in general. It also has some themes around religion. And on top of that, it's just really queer in, like, every angle. It's very queer, very sex positive. I just really, really loved it. I don't read a whole lot of really heavy sci-fi fantasy, but the fact that this was really character driven, I think made it a really great reading experience for me. The Seep fit the prompt for a main character who is trans. Next, I read Persepolis II. Now, this is the complete Persepolis, but I read the first part in May, I believe, or possibly April. But I read the second one. I read the second part this month, and I really enjoyed it. I love a graphic memoir. And the way that she uses the graphic memoir, I think works really, really well. I think this is the best one that I've read in terms of characters. I think that all of the people that she talks about, like her grandmother and her father, and a lot of these other people, they really come through as characters, as well as her, obviously, but, I mean, you as a character, I would think, is probably the easiest one to write. But there's a lot of really important stuff that goes on here. The first half, so Persepolis 1, talks about her growing up in Iran. And in Persepolis 2, it's when she ends up having to go off and moves to Austria, I believe. and goes to high school there, meets some other people, and has to deal with the kind of culture shock of going there and really falling into that culture so much that she loses herself. And then when she comes back to Iran, she has to really figure out what pieces are her. Really, it's a process of self-discovery and dealing with trauma when you live in a place that has a lot of war going on. I'm also really glad that I read it because I honestly don't get to hear a whole lot about Iran. A lot of the information from like school and everything else as like adolescence and even into college, the only thing that I really got was very biased, very colored by the fact that the United States wanted oil that was in the Middle East. So I was really glad that I got a chance to read something by someone who is actually from that area talking about the history. The next book that I read, and the final book that I finished within that 1 week, was the first volume of Saga. This was a great start to this series. This is another sci-fi fantasy, but in this, our two main characters are each from planets that are on opposing sides. They end up running away and having a child. In this book, they are heavily on the run and trying to get off of the planet so that they won't be found and so that they can keep their baby safe. There's a lot that goes on in this book. Like, I know it's not that big, but it jumps from their perspective to like two other characters' perspectives, and as well as just being an engaging story. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on so far as gray morality goes. There's also potential to talk about colonialism in a lot of ways, and I really hope that they actually get into that more. And to add kind of another layer to this whole thing is narrated by the baby from the future, looking back at this. So I'm really interested to see the rest of this. I really want to find these other comics. I'll probably end up buying the other two individually, and then hopefully I'll buy the rest in the larger bound books. After that 8-book reading week, I ended up finishing 2 more books. The first one of those is A Party for Lola by Caitlin Rickey. A Party for Lola was a really short but sweet story about a polycule full of trans and non-binary people who are basically going to celebrate one of their birthdays. It's just a really low-key, wholesome story. I maybe would have liked more from it in some technical ways, but honestly, it was just a good little story. We need more queer, wholesome stories. This fit the Transathon prompt for a book with multiple trans characters, and it fit the Fuckathon prompt for fuck book elitism. And then the final book of the month that I finished was Gender Outlaw by Kate Bornstein. I started to read this in April, I think. Probably April. There's really no reason as to why I kind of stopped in the middle, because this was just really good overall. Kate Bornstein is one of the big voices in gender studies. In this, they really talk a whole lot about gender and kind of how it works in society, and also framework for understanding how it works for different people. They integrate discussing this framework and discussing society along with their own personal story. So you get to learn a lot about Kate Bornstein. I think that this is a very accessible text, which is great because there are a number of gender studies texts that are just absolutely unreadable. So I'm really glad that this one is a lot more accessible. I would say that there are probably some things that I didn't 100% agree with. They were either nitpicky things or stuff that wasn't exactly on the topic of gender. It has more to do with inter-community oppression. But I mean, honestly, it's small things. I think that this is a really helpful book. And interestingly enough, this actually ends with a play and then a monologue. So it was really cool to tie in with Queering the Stage. Additionally, Kate Bornstein performed in one of Jack Shamblin's things. So that was a cool little connection. Me posting about this book when I started reading it was actually the reason that Jack Shamblin reached out to give me the copy that I have now. So that's really cool that I got to finish this while reading that, and this had a play at the end of it. It was a good time. Gender Outlaw fit 2 prompts, a book written by a non-binary person and a non-fiction book about trans people. So those are all of the books that I finished, but I also have a stack of books that I started that I want to talk a little bit about and my plans so far is finishing reading them. So the first book that I have that I started but did not finish is Revolutionary by Alex Myers. This book focuses on Deborah Sampson, who was an actual person during the Revolutionary War, who was a woman who dressed up as a man to fight in the revolution. The person who wrote this is a trans guy and is actually related to Deborah Sampson. To hear a podcast where he talks about this book and Deborah Sampson, definitely check out my description because that was a really cool podcast episode. I did not get really far into this book at all. I made it to page 17, so that's where I was at with the mid-month wrap-up. I think I might set this back down and pick it up later. Part of it just has to do with the fact that this just isn't the era that I tend to read, and I just think that I need like a little bit of a break and then to come back and reread it while expecting kind of the assault scene that happens, and then I think that I can maybe get into it a little bit better. Another book that I mentioned during my mid-month media wrap-up is The Wisdom of the Enneagram. I'm still working my way through this. I feel like I forget to mention books like this on my booktube a lot. I don't really know why. I'm reading some of them. They just, I guess, are a little bit different from the stuff that I normally read, so I tend to forget about them. But they have been helpful for me. I like the personality framework. So this is one of the books that I'm going to be kind of reading as I go along. This isn't one that I like sit down with the intention to like read it from start to finish. I take little bits and pieces and read it one at a time. Before the mid-month media wrap-up, I read basically a big chunk of the beginning, and I have since read the first section where it talks about my Enneagram type 9s, but I do also want to go back and read about the other types as well, but there's not really a time constraint on that. The next book that I started reading was The Revolution Manifesto. This book looks at Marx and Lenin's theory of revolution and talks about the context, talks about pieces of it to help you better understand it. I, again, have not read this since my mid-month check-in. This is something that I am planning on continuing to read. However, I want to finish The State and the Revolution by Lenin first and then get into this. Because I've read Marx, but I haven't read Lenin, so I want to read Lenin first. So yeah, that's just going to be like on my TBR. The book that I started after it, because I decided I needed to read it, was The State and the Revolution. And that one is just one that I'm going to be continually working on. I'm just going to be reading it when I'm feeling like a more political-oriented book. Going along with the theme of politically oriented books, we have Eco-Socialism, which I started during the week where I was reading 8 books. This one was a little bit dense. I just kind of stopped being in the mood for it because I read the Seep and then just wanted to read a bunch of fantasy. This is one that I do plan on continuing to read. I want to finish it to see kind of what all it says. So again, like with The State and the Revolution, I'm just going to read it when I'm feeling like reading it. Hopefully, if things pan out like I want them to, I will probably read each of those in like maybe 1 or 2 sittings each. Neither of them are very long, and I do want to be able to get through them. If I take too long between times reading them, I feel like I'll forget stuff. So I want to be sure that I'm able to absorb the whole thing. So that's where I am with those. I haven't put either of these on next month's TBR, but I'll probably work on them some next month, but they might not be the very top of my priority list. The next book that I started reading, again during that week-long challenge, was The Shadows of the Dark Crystal. And I was super stoked to read this because it's the Dark Crystal, and I really liked that movie when I was little. I read some of the graphic novels last year, and I've gotten into this. I think that I have gotten over the kind of hump of feeling out high fantasy. I have a really bad time with fantasy sometimes because I'll end up DNFing. Like, I can't tell you how many times I started and stopped the first Lord of the Rings book or The Hobbit before actually reading them, and I still haven't finished the Lord of the Rings series, so that kind of tells you how difficult it is for me to get into more high fantasy stuff. But I think that I can really get into this, and I'll probably continue reading it throughout the month, this coming month. The next book that I started to read was The Source of Selfregard by Toni Morrison. I really wish that I had started reading this earlier on in the month because it is fantastic. I knew that it was going to be good because Toni Morrison is good. Sula was excellent, and Toni Morrison's a legend. Even if I hadn't read anything by her before, I would know about her. the way that she uses language in general is just absolutely unparalleled. And it is just as efficient at just slapping you in the face in nonfiction as she is in fiction. I'm honestly kind of stuck on how I want to read this, because part of me wants to just sit down and read as much of it as I can, especially since this was a group read. So I want to finish it sooner rather than later. But at the same time, it's so good, and this is a series of essays and meditations. So I almost want to read it slowly. So we'll end up seeing where I land with this. I feel like this is going to end up being the book that I prioritize the most out of the books that I have not finished yet this month. And then finally, the last book that I started this month was Intersectionality is Critical Social Theory by Patricia Hill Collins. This was a book that I did not anticipate finishing this month, and I actually have it. Wow. And I actually have it on August's TBR. I really did not get very far through it, but it's really good already so far, which I didn't expect anything less because it's Patricia Hill Collins. She's focusing on intersectionality, and throughout this book she's talking about how people can use it actively, like sort of creating intersectionality and creating a discourse that can be used both academically and on the ground by activists. So I think what's going to happen with this book is that there are going to be pieces and sections about different identities and different aspects of society, so that you can kind of weave them together. And the goal of this book isn't to read this book and then do intersectionality. The point of this book is to help you understand intersectionality and facilitate the conversation that is necessary in order for us to act in a way that considers the existence of intersectionality. So I am super stoked. I love Patricia Hill Collins. So this book I'm really excited to get to. I am definitely aiming to finish both of these by the end of the month. If none of the other books, these are highest on my priority list. These two and Moving Politics. Those are my top three. If you watch my TBR, you'll see me rant a little bit about the fact that I still have not finished that book. Before I go, I do want to mention one book, because I did not get to start this book, and I was mad that I did not get to start this book, so it will probably be going to next month. I probably won't fit it into any challenges, but I'll probably just start reading it soon, and that's Nama by Sarah Blake. I have been waiting months and months to just get my copy. I should have just started reading it right when I got it, but I didn't. So now I'm here, and I'm probably going to read this in the month of August. So that is what I read during the month of July, what I failed to finish during the month of July. It was a really good time. I was happy that I got to read 8 books in a week. I thought that was an accomplishment, especially with starting 3 other ones in the middle of that week as well. I had a really fun time vlogging it too. I don't know how good the vlogs are necessarily, but they were a good time, so I'll probably do that more. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, and let me know what you've been reading this past month. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.